So in the last 12 months, of course, Tata Steel UK has performed the groundbreaking ceremony for the new electric arc furnace, the £1.25 billion investment for the arc furnace, the continuous casters, the hot mill and the brand new pickle line. Lots of people think that job is now done and it's just a case of constructing some new assets. But actually the job is far from done, and one of the key aspects of the project that will deem it to be a success or not will be how we can source scrap, something like 2 million tonnes of it every year, to feed that furnace in the right quality, the right quantity at the right time. So at Metals Expo, what better place to come and find someone who can talk to us about the challenges around scrap in the UK than Cam Pleydell-Pearce, old friend of the pod. Cam, great to see you from Swansea University.
Thanks, Tim.
Cam, where are we at with the scrap picture?
Oh, it's complicated but exciting and plenty of opportunity, I would say. I mean, I think just to repeat some of the obvious stuff before we get into the more detailed things. Obviously, the UK currently has an abundance of scrap, which it's currently exporting.
Yeah.
So about 80% of our material is currently exported. And so therefore, there's plenty of opportunity to build a scrap-intensive business in the UK. So the strategy is right. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing you need to think about then is what elements are coming through in the scrap supply chain and how that, so chemical elements, then how that translates to the specifications that you have for the product portfolio. And that means that the scrap requirements for different businesses will change as a function of the products that they intend to sell. And so that's the context then for the discussion. And then, well, what needs to be done is a question of the degree to which you need to be able to manage your input materials to ensure that you're delivering to customers effectively with your products.
Yeah, because it is a more complex picture than people realise, and we were just talking to Laura Baker earlier about whether we can make all the grades necessary from an electric arc furnace, and she was effectively saying, well, it depends what you put into the arc furnace. And people think that scrap steel in the UK is one picture, but of course it isn't. And I started my career up in British Steel Stainless. They take stainless steel scrap, which I don't know if it's a different supply route, but it's certainly a different product.
Yeah.
And like you say, it's about what you put in and what you get out. But currently the scrap supply chain in the UK is I hesitate to say it's fairly basic, but it's not set up necessarily to produce the highest quality scrap and segregated. Is that fair?
I think so currently, as I've already said, it's an export market, right? And that means that really you're looking at this more from a commodity perspective than potentially from a valuable resource perspective. That's understandable because, it's really about the volume. We've got 8 million tons of material that we've got to shift through these export markets, and it's really just about trying to collect, process that material as effectively as possible, optimize your logistics and get it out the door.
Yeah.
I think what we're looking to as the whole ecosystem in the UK steelmaking area heads more towards, let's call it scrap intensive, if not full recycling, then you're going to end up with more challenges there in terms of optimizing which elements of the scrap go to which places. So you said it's treated as a sort of a whole, but in fact scrap's very heterogeneous,
right? And
there are lots of different components that go into it. So some elements of it have very, very low levels of elements, and they're almost close to pure iron. So some of the products that Tata produce for body and white applications in automotive, for example, very much pure iron. And then in other cases for engineering steels, you're getting richer in elements like chromium. And then as you said, the stainless steels, you're rich in chromium and nickel and a few other things. And so that means that we've got to, if you treat that all just as one pile, then it becomes very, very difficult to get the elements where they need to go. And I think all the interventions that we need to make in the UK are about responsibly directing the elements to the right steel makers so that they can produce the right products sustainably into the future. I think if we don't manage this properly, then we risk the elements ending up in the wrong places. And the big problem that we have is once they're melted into the steel, it becomes very difficult to get them out. So we need to make some interventions now which are going to improve that situation and give us a long-term healthy outlook for the sector in the future.
But the challenge, I guess, is not just of segregating the materials, either physically or chemically, and gaining most value out of them and putting the right materials in the right supply chain. It sounds like somehow we've got to change the fundamental business model of the scrap supply chain that goes from 80% export to, we're going to take 2 million tonnes. If British Steel go down the electric arc furnace route, they'll take 2 million tonnes. How keen is the scrap industry to change their model?
I mean, I think they are ultimately, but of course there's an existing infrastructure that's there, and then you kind of have to we're going to have to tear ourselves away from that if the imperative for steel making and resilience in the UK supply chains for steel-intensive manufacturing industries is going to be realised. So then we have to disrupt to a degree.
Yeah.
Let's dip into policy quickly.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of talk about a scrap export ban, for example, but
Yep.
that is dangerous territory because you're basically ruining an export market when we don't currently have a growth in the domestic consumption of the material to fulfill it.
Yeah.
So if you just arbitrarily overnight introduce a scrap export ban, what are we going to do? Are we going to start stockpiling millions and millions and millions of tons of material overnight?
Yeah.
But talk like that instantly introduces a bit of friction in the supply chain that is actually counterproductive. So we need to move away from that, and we need to start looking at where's the value proposition that exists both for the steel makers and for the scrap suppliers.
Yeah.
Okay? And then I can dip back into the technical, which is to say it's very hard to evaluate that if you don't know the composition of the material.
Yeah.
And you don't have the tools required to be able to predict how the composition of material is going to change over time. And in a whole economy's worth of steel, end-of-life steel production, you're talking years and years and years into the future.
Yeah.
What we're trying to do in collaboration with Tata Steel and some of their supply chain partners in projects like the Rectify project is actually dip into that and understand that compositional profile and start to pick apart forensically where's the material coming from. And that gives you a better idea of what's in there. Once you know what's in there, it's easier to build a business model of extraction of elements which can be sold in their own right, like copper, for example, but which also gives purification, which is what the steel industry wants for the iron that's in there. Then once you have the data, you can start to say, right, there's actually an investment case for the scrap companies to do greater levels of purification, and of course the steel industry will benefit from that as well. They'll probably have to pay slightly more, but there's a point at which you meet in the middle. So if you collaborate across the supply chain, then you're much more likely to find a what I call holistically sustainable solution. So which is not just environmentally sustainable, not just resilient, but economically sustainable as well.
And I think the finances are absolutely key to this. But if not being an expert in the field, but if I was to challenge you back, I was saying the content of future steels must be fairly predictable. And I know grades change and adapt over time, but not massively. And surely someone in a black carbon steels business can say to you, I can tell you exactly what elements of iron, copper, molybdenum, zinc, chromium that we have in our current production route and what we're going to need in the future, because it's not going to be vastly different.
Yeah, so there is a session coming up later on, I think, where they're talking about the potential for recycling material through end-of-life vehicles and processing that and closing the loop. And I think that you need to look at it on a sector-by-sector basis. So we've only talked so far about scrap suppliers and steel makers, but the end users of the material and their responsibilities for their own products through end-of-life vehicle directive, for example. Packaging will be the same. Construction, I think, is going to start ending up in the same space as well. Closing the loop, and I think you start to look at it on a sector at a time, and that enables you to start to look at how, and then, so rebar needs to go back to Severn Steel, for example. That's in the UK, that's where it needs to go, because they produce rebar, so you try to match those compositions through. You don't want that in a stripped steel business, because it tends to be that the copper levels are inherently higher, without getting too technical, and that makes it harder to produce a car. Right?
It's really hard.
So, but it sounds like that's impossible to do, but I don't think it's impossible if you build a sustainable business model around it. If you give somebody a commercial imperative to do it, then it will happen. And I think you need to start, but you can't just look at it as an entire problem across manufacturing. Whatever that ends up being. I think you've got to look at it on a sector-by-sector basis.
And I know we could talk about this for hours, but we're talking about the electric arc furnace being up and running operational 2028, early 2028.
Yes.
That's not very far away. We can't wait until then to solve the problem.
No.
What's happening today in 2025 to start predicting those problems and overcoming them and developing the supply chain and the assets around them?
So there's two things, really. I mean, in the project that I run, Sustain, we've done an assessment where we've actually gone out to the US, we've gone to Belgium, Poland, a couple of different places, and looked at the best practice in scrap processing capability. Actually, what that's told us is that the capability to remove contamination at the industrial scale at high levels of throughput already exists.
Wow.
So then so there are things that you can do just from an investment perspective which can solve your problem straight away. the thing is, so that's a good thing. So there's something that you can do straight away. The question then is, if in the process of doing that you take material that other companies want in the UK ecosystem, and currently we're talking about incumbents, but there's the potential to grow the sector into the future as well.
Right.
Then, unless there's a collaboration across the different requirements at the end use phase, but across the steel makers as well, then there's a potential for them to, what am I trying to say? To stitch each other up in a way by taking a high volume of high quality material that isn't necessarily required. So, for example, if rebar producers took all of very high quality material,
Yeah.
everyone else is, but they don't need to do that, and so that's the difficult bit. So there are things that we can do immediately, and the technology already exists. You need to make an investment case, which is coming back to where you need the data on what's in the material.
Yeah.
But that's actually relatively easy to do. You can do it straight away. The wider balance between the requirements of different steel makers who produce different products and the requirements of the sectors that they serve is something that will take longer, but we need to work on. And that my new project Ignite is what's trying to do that.
That sounds like the topic for another podcast. So there's a couple of things I know we've got you for a long time, and I know you're a busy man, but there's a couple of other things kind of wanted to say, because Gareth Stace was here yesterday, and he says one of the beauties about the UK steel industry is it's composed of businesses that don't compete.
Correct.
Now, they may compete chemically, I guess, when it comes to scrap, but all of a sudden that probably makes that challenge a bit easier in terms of people stitching each other up. But the final question I was going to ask you is, what you've described seems like some sort of industrial supply chain collaboration with academia and investment and throwing money at it.
Yes.
What role has the government got to play in supportive policies that will also enable this to happen over the next 3 years?
Yeah, I think the government is already doing the preliminary work in that area. So they are convening things like the Scrap Working Group, which is sort of sponsored by Department of Business and Trade, and that's bringing the supply chain together. So the dialogue is happening. And I think also that in collaboration with that, some of the membership organisations and trade associations are starting to collaborate more. There's a good dialogue and relationship that exists between the BMRA, the British Metals Recycling Association, and UK Steel, for example, at the moment in that space. And that means that we're having a more productive, evidence-based discussion on potential policy interventions. The really important thing and brilliant thing that I see in the current administration and the civil service supporting the current administration is that they want to find the solution that is going to be most effective
for UK PLC.
Yes, for UK PLC, and it is focused on the UK's sovereign capability. And that plus the non-competitive nature of the products that are being produced by the incumbents in the sector at the moment from a steelmaking perspective means that I think there's a reasonable opportunity. There's goodwill on all sides, I think, to see a solution.
And I guess we're blessed as a country because we've got all this scrap lying around that we can use in the steel industry. And from what you're saying, the right people are on board, the right people understand it. It's just there's a piece of pace that's required behind it, and there's probably a piece of investment behind this.
Yes.
But it sounds like we're heading in the right direction.
I think we are. I'm excited about it. I'm sure it's a nut we're all going to crack.
Nice one. Thanks very much for your time, Cam. Enjoy the day. Good to see you here as ever. And we'll catch up with you soon.
Okay.
Nice
thanks
one.
a lot.
Thank you. So one of the key topics around decarbonising the UK steel industry is the topic of scrap. We've already talked to Cam Pleydell-Pearce from Swansea University, who gave us a great overview about the challenges for that sector. I'm also delighted to be joined by Pete Hodgson from our sustainability team, who's been on a panel talking about potential buyback schemes in the automotive sector. Now, Pete, this may not be that new in terms of talking to car makers about the scrap that they have that we could use in our processes. But now we're going to electric arc furnace production. That makes that slightly different and slightly easier for us.
Yeah, it's a really attractive option. So scrap from the likes of automotive manufacturers or construction sector manufacturers, scrap that they produce or generate as part of their manufacturing process is nice, clean scrap. Its composition is well known. It's not contaminated with stuff that might come through the use of steel. Like food contamination in packaging scrap and so on. So its composition is well known. It's not contaminated with other stuff that it might pick up. So it's an attractive source of scrap for our new arc furnace process.
Yeah, I can imagine. I remember years ago talking to someone about recycling cars at end of life, and one of the issues there was when you got all that copper, aluminium, lead, cadmium, all the other sorts of stuff that's all mixed up. But if you can get the scrap, so I guess it comes from, like, if you're making a car door and you're stamping it out, it's the bits left over from that in automotive, is it?
Yeah, exactly. Think of where your window goes in your car door. It's that hole. That scrap is stamped out in the automotive manufacturer and is then available as a nice clean source of scrap material.
But lots of zinc on that though, Pete.
Lots of zinc. We supply galvanized steel to the automotive manufacturers for its corrosion properties. But that's in an arc furnace. The galvanized scrap, the zinc content is not really an issue. The zinc in the arc furnace, the zinc comes off in the fume. It can be collected in the dust, and then that zinc-rich dust can be sold back to the zinc manufacturers as a valuable resource. So a really nice example of the circular economy.
Yeah, it does seem a positive thing to do, because one of the debates we always have about scrap in the UK is like, there's plenty of it, but it needs segregating. But this, and it's not just the automotive sector, presumably, other industries like packaging, although I guess you've got tin as an issue. Construction, I know they're very keen to reuse in construction and repurpose rather than recycle. But the UK is a scrap-rich economy, isn't it?
It is indeed. We export something like 10 million tonnes of scrap. Well, there's 10 million tonnes arising in the UK of scrap each year, and we don't have the capacity at the moment in the UK to take that and put that through our processes. So much of it is exported, and really, the scrap is a strategic resource for the UK.
Yep.
It's in a shortage of supply globally, so it makes perfect sense for us to use that in the UK as part of our strategic resource and part of our decarbonisation agenda.
And I know you were on a panel there with some colleagues from Tata Steel, but also from one of the scrap companies. How would this propose? Is it a proposed buyback scheme, or is it currently existing? How would it work with that sector?
I think it's a good question. I think that's in development, in discussion at the moment. It could work with individual OEMs, perhaps, but it could also work with the scrap suppliers to be as intermediaries. To be worked out. I think the details of that, but I'm aware that there have been some trials in the past, so I think it works in principle. It's putting the details to those arrangements, I think.
So I know automotive manufacturers have always been keen on having multiple suppliers, so you're never going to get 100% Tata Steel supply into any car maker, and they balance their risks. They'll have material from ArcelorMittal and ThyssenKrupp and SSAB and so forth. Would a buyback scheme in the UK effectively say to the car maker, wherever you get your steel from, we will take the scrap? Is that fair?
Potentially, or it may be that the automotive, the manufacturer would be able to segregate the scrap according to manufacturer, according to grade, according to manufacturer. Yeah. I think that's in the detail, but it makes sense if we're delivering some products to a customer, rather than make use of that logistics efficiently. Let's make use of the return journeys and bring valuable materials back into our operations.
Yeah, and we mentioned briefly before we turned the camera on about EPDs. Could you explain what those are and the role of scrap in those?
Yeah, so EPDs are environmental product declarations, and they're a particular currency, if you like, in the construction sector for disclosing the environmental product attributes of your product. So carbon footprint is the one that most people will be familiar with. EPDs will go into other environmental categories, and scrap is one of the raw materials, just like ore-based metallics or like zinc on a galvanized product that you sort of take account of, that you model in the way in which you calculate an EPD, and scrap has the benefits of using scrap, the benefits of recycling. The benefits of recycling at end of life are all quantified and captured in an environmental product declaration.
And I know there's lots of other people to talk to, Pete, and I've got to let you get away, but I guess my final question would be, what does the automotive industry think about this as a concept?
I think they'd be interested. I think they want to talk to us about it. That they want to work in partnership with us. A lot of the way in which to deliver a more sustainable outcome for the planet, for all of society, is to work in partnership with your suppliers, with your customers. It's about partnerships and collaboration. So I think they're up for it.
Listen, thanks very much for your time today, Pete. Thanks for explaining that. The idea of this sort of more circularity, certainly within the automotive supply chain, seems an obvious route to go down, and fingers crossed we can take that forward.
Okay, thanks, Tim.
Thanks again. Cheers.
Bye.
Delighted to be back with another fellow steel producer, Gabriella. Welcome to the podcast. I don't think we've had you on before, so
You haven't. So I'm very glad to be, well, here, not in a typical podcast room, but out and about. So yes, thank you for having me.
no problem. And obviously there's been lots going on today. You've just been on a panel, Women in Industry, but I actually want to talk to you about scrap. So obviously, like I said, you're a fellow steel producer in South Wales via the electric arc furnace steel making route. And obviously we're headed that way. We're going to need a lot of scrap, a lot of domestic scrap. Do you see there being a strategy in place? Is there one around the corner? Is my first sort of question. And then also I want to ask you about some challenges and opportunities that maybe you've identified.
Yeah. So will there be a scrap strategy? I think it's quite hard to tell at the moment. Anyone would think, given its importance for the sector, especially as we've transitioned, we have an EAF, but for those in the process of transitioning, you would anticipate that government will come together and look at developing a scrap strategy for the UK. I think the challenge though is around timescales, and if you were to ask me when I think this might happen, I would respond and say, how long is a piece of string? And so in that sense, I think that there's good intent, but my real concern is the speed of implementation with anything, particularly that of a scrap strategy. But it's true across kind of all government policy areas that it's when we're going to see action actually unfold. So I'm not too sure. Obviously, on a personal level, I think that we should. At a business level, I think that we need a scrap strategy for the UK. Why? We're sat on a hotbed of this raw material. We've got about 10 million tonnes of scrap in circulation here in the UK. We're exporting most of that. And obviously, understandably, for historical reasons, the steel sector here in the UK, the biggest producers were blast furnaces. Obviously, we're undergoing this transition, so things are going to look very different. So there's a real opportunity to capitalise on a strategic raw material. However, the challenge lies, I think, in finding cross-sector agreement. I think the one thing that we're definitely, as a steel sector, looking to do is make sure that environmental and potentially social standards are upheld, so that whenever we are exporting our scrap, we're exporting it to countries with similar standards to us here in the UK. And I don't think that that's anything new if you look at what we do with other waste streams like plastics, and in general our kind of view around how we export waste. There's a lot more emphasis about upholding standards and ensuring that we are responsible as a country in terms of where that material is ending up. So yeah, I mean, that's a very quick synopsis of where we are today, which is nowhere with a scrap strategy. Opportunity, both for us as the steel industry, but also downstream in terms of job creation, innovation, developments within the scrap sector, but challenges in terms of finding all the right common ground. But I think it works. I think it does work for the steel sector and the scrap sector to find some common ground. It's just how we do that. I don't know if you had any more questions to that point, but
Yeah, I do actually, and you've sort of answered them already. But obviously, you work for Seven Steel in Cardiff, Tata Steel in South Wales, and the government has been a key partner in our 1.25 billion transition to green steel making. But I imagine you think they could probably do more. Like, what do they need to do next when it comes to addressing the big issue of scrap?
What do they need to do next? Well, I think we just need to have the steel strategy out. It's been pushed and pushed and pushed, and obviously there's a lot of reasons behind that. So again, going back to my point of what do they need to do, not necessarily more in terms of ideas. I think there's a lot of ideas and there's a lot of hard work that's going on behind the scenes. It is just about speed of implementation, actually coming out with clear timescales. Because whatever we do, if we end up having a scrap strategy, which I think would be the right thing, we have a critical raw materials like strategy here in the UK, so we definitely need something, but we just need to get on with it. So I think this is the big issue of, by the time we get round to anything being announced, and then a working group being formed, and then a first meeting, and then consultations, time has passed, and time is very much of the essence. So I think the underlying rhetoric is that come out with whatever it is that you're thinking about doing quite quickly so that we can get on with it, because we collectively as a sector, but also individual businesses, we want to get around that table and get going with the ideas and get going with how it is that we're actually going to implement anything. Scrap is obviously a particularly sensitive subject, given the transition the sector's on. But yeah, I wouldn't say more, I'd just say faster. Do you know what I mean?
Time is of the essence, as you said.
Yeah, very much so, particularly given the state of play for the sector this year. 2025 has been really, really challenging on a commercial level. We haven't seen, we obviously have a deluge of imports here in the UK, but yeah, demand challenges as well. But just we look at the construction sector and other sectors, and there is really weak demand. So it's not been a good year for steel, and that Sunny Uplands piece is really hinged on a steel strategy and everything underpinning that, which will be scrap, given its importance for both of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was Gareth Stace who said from UK Steel on an earlier session, it's not just about surviving, it's about thriving. So fingers crossed that the steel strategy can bring that.
Yeah, when will that day come? I don't know. Well, hopefully. I think we have been in a continuous state of survival. And now it really, this government gets it. I think they genuinely do understand that steel is an essential material, and it will form the backbone of the economy. But we have been surviving, and we've spent most of this year trying to survive. And it's a case of, if we're looking to attract inward investment, and if we're looking to really press ahead with a lot of the plans that we have, then we need the right policy framework. And I think that's really the missing piece. We can argue about specifics, but if we don't have the right business environment to ensure that we are competitive and that there's parity with us and our near neighbours in Europe or even further afield, then all we will see is deindustrialisation. And I think that's the last thing any of us want. We need strong domestic supply chains, and underpinning that is a healthy, competitive business landscape. Underpinning that is the right policy. And I think that's what we are hopeful that the steel strategy starts to set out. But again, timescales, implementation, that will really determine the success of all of it, but also the success of us from moving from that survival state to thriving state. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to Tata Steel UK, we've got an amazing future ahead of us, a really good pathway set out towards low CO2 steel making, but it all comes back to policy framework. Like you said, it's not going to be a successful future unless we have the right competitive, fair environment.
Yeah, exactly. EAF is, and I, a credit to Tata for what you've done. EAF isn't the solution to the problem. That's one part of it. But as an EAF steel producer in South Wales, Severn Steel, we've been grappling with a number of policy issues for a long time. I think what's been helpful is through your transition, you've added weight and you help kind of carry the voice in terms of what change is needed. But be under no illusion that you might be able to build an EAF. Scunthorpe eventually might have an EAF, but it's what's underpinning the success of that is effective policy here in the UK. And I think that's the thing where there is nervousness, because ultimately we need parity on electricity, we need competitive electricity prices, we need strong trade defence measures in place to deal with global excess capacity, which I know is obviously a big topic of conversation. You look at what the US are doing, you look at what EU are doing in terms of measures that they're putting in place to protect those domestic industries. We need to ensure procurement. Ultimately, we want to drive demand for low carbon products, but drive demand for domestic products produced here in the UK. So we want a strong supply chain, and procurement underpins a lot of that. And then obviously that scrap piece is the essential raw material. What do we do? We're sat on this hotbed. We've got an opportunity to capitalise, and an opportunity that could add value to everyone in the supply chain. So how do we make all of these kind of pieces work, and how do we make sure all government policy links in and works in tandem with each other and not against each other? So yeah, big questions, but I think we have a lot of the answers to it. It's just a case of how it's all synchronized together and ultimately when it's going to happen. So yeah.
Well, thanks, Gabriella. I think you've actually just summarised most of our key policy asks in one answer.
Yeah. Electricity, trade, procurement, carbon leakage. Yeah, no, I didn't mention carbon leakage, but I think that's a topic for another day. But yeah, I think the fantastic thing about the steel sector is that we get to work together. You know, we're not necessarily in direct competition with one another, and there's a real opportunity for kind of collaboration and making sure that our voice is strong and that we can take that challenge to government, but also work together to ensure that we have the right mechanisms in place for us all to do well, because we can. It's just a matter of hopefully if not when. So we'll see.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end on. Thank you, Gabriella.
A positive note.
We like a positive note. That's a bit of a theme for today, actually.
Exactly. But thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gabriella. Catch you soon. Thank you.